Welcome back to a costumed edition of the Beginner's Guide to the 18th Century. My name is Kendall, and I am so excited to be joined by Rebecca Olds of Timesmith Dressmaking. Rebecca, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Kendall. It's a pleasure to be here.
I first heard about you, found out about you last year when you were creating this incredible experience in Scotland with the now infamous Isabella Fraser Gown. And I'm sure lots of people are well aware of that experience and getting to kind of be part of it virtually, which is really interesting actually, because now that we're forced into this virtual experience, thinking back on that time, putting that weekend together where you and multiple other costumers created that beautiful gown and that experience in Scotland, it must be a little bit surreal to think about that virtual time period back then. And then now, of course, you're just totally ready for it. You're just here for the virtual. You've got it, right?
You're right. It does feel quite surreal. In some ways, it feels like a lifetime ago. Last year, so much has happened and so much has changed. Looking at it, you mentioning it in that way, I'm so glad we did it last year.
Yeah.
If there had been any kind of delays that had pushed it further back, it wouldn't be happening in the foreseeable future. But that was a window of opportunity we had when the original dress was on loan to a museum for its exhibition. That original dress lives on display indefinitely in Inverness, where it gets a steady trickle of people who see it and fall in love with it or walk on by it, don't notice it. But it was really showcased at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh last year. And that 6 months when it was on display there, we knew that was our moment, that was when we needed to try to, that if we were going to bring the story of how a dress like that was made in the time period and show people how dressmakers worked then, with that as our reference to say, watch us as we explain, and then go check out, just in the next room. It was really a once in a lifetime opportunity. Unfortunately, the original dress is on display again, back in its home in Inverness. So it's not like it's disappeared. I think it will continue inspiring tartan wedding fandom all over the world. I've been called Isabella Mactavish Fraser fan club. There's so many people around the world who love this dress. It is unique. There are lots of silk gowns and cotton chintz gowns and things, but it's the only 18th century tartan gown. There are a few, there's silk tartan in the 19th century, but a wool tartan gown, 18th century style, 18th century whole way of working, and the way it's constructed, the way it's cut, the way it's fitted. It is, as far as we know, and believe me, lots of people have been looking, but it is the only one that's known. And I think if there were any others, they would have been flushed out by now.
I think so. Sitting in someone's attic somewhere. So I
by now.
Yeah. Considering, that experience that happened last year, I imagine that a whole lot happened in your life leading up to that. So if you could give us a background on how you got started in the living history community and sewing and having this amazing passion for this, we would love to hear that.
Well, I grew up in a very history and reading family, books and fiction and non-fiction alike, and had read a fair number of 18th century set novels as a child. Georgia Hare, who not only wrote Regency set, but a fair number of Georgian set novels. Also, there was a long series of novels about a family that was sort of founded. It's a family saga. I forget how many books there are, about 10, that are set, or they start in colonial Williamsburg, and they're by Ellsworth Fane, and they're often referred to as the Williamsburg novels. They were written, I believe, in the 30s, around the time that colonial Williamsburg was beginning restoration work there and being laid out and planned, and the funding from Rockefeller making that happen. So the author had a real passion for that history, that time period, the American Revolution, and the social changes, lots of social commentary in those novels. And as a child, I mean, I suppose I've been rereading them as an adult just this past year, and finding I noticed all sorts of little subtle social history cues that as a child I wasn't aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Things like women's voices and how the poor are treated, and class distinctions, power struggles, who has a voice and who doesn't. Things like that I didn't notice as a child. But anyway, that laid the I think probably the kind of the groundwork as a child. And I learned to sew when I was young, and sewed a lot of my wardrobe when I was a teenager. And then kind of real life caught on. I grew up in Oregon on the west coast of America, and when I was 20, I made my first vacation to Europe, to England and to France, and fell in love with it out here. And that pretty much the travel back and forth all through my 20s taken up with, working, saving money to travel. And I wasn't so, a lot of times I didn't have a long-term, I seemed to be moving quite frequently, so I didn't have a long-term place to store. So I didn't have a sewing machine, I wasn't sewing at all. Reading, continuing to read. At some point a few years ago, a number of things sort of happened to force a shift for me. The interest in history and women's history had always been there. I'd never been into fashion per se, but I was always interested in what real people's lives were like in the past. And that does include, what they wore, what they had next to their bodies all the time. Didn't give it a lot of thought. Then a few years ago, a couple of things. My mother, who was a very skilled seamstress, died, and I was planning my wedding. And we found, in the genealogy work that we've been doing in my family, we found that we'd grown up being told that my father's family had a Scottish immigrant line, and then we found it was actually my mother. It was my mother who had a Scottish line, and we found out who it was. That they had a chap that immigrated from the Highlands, just out of Inverness, just after Culloden, went to North Carolina, married a girl there, and that started, a little bit of, that story in the New World, if you like. So that was kind of all coming together. And planning my wedding and thinking about designing my wedding dress, my dressmaker, knowing what my interests were, she's flicking through Pinterest on her iPad as I'm trying to describe that I would like a quite smooth, tight-fitting, conical type torso. And because she's not a historical dressmaker, I didn't know how. I didn't feel that I could say, I want 18th century, I want Georgian. I was trying to describe it in sort of design terms. And she's flicking through her iPad, and she said, "Oh, you mean like this?" And it was the Isabella Mactavish Fraser. And I just, as the saying goes, mind blown. It was just. Mm-hmm. It was tartan. It was a wedding dress. It was red, and red is my color. Mm-hmm. We were getting married in Scotland. We were planning our wedding in Scotland. As it happens, we were getting married on Skye, which is where the current owner of the dress lives. It was just everything. It was meant to be. It was meant to be. Mm-hmm. Through social media, I got introduced to the museum, and on our honeymoon, literally 3 days after our wedding, we went to the museum for a hands-on with the curator visit to view the dress out of its display case. We saw it in the atrium in natural light. The colors are just glowing. And the owner of the dress was there that day to arrange something that she needed to discuss with the curator. So we had lunch with her. It was like everything. At that point, I knew that I wanted personally to make a dress like that. Mm-hmm. Not for my wedding, but going forward, I was really starting to think, I really want to make dresses like this. I want to make them myself and not just look at pretty pictures. And I was really interested in how they're really made. Cut and construction has really been the driving. How these things were made, who made them, how did they make them? And eventually, over time, as I researched that, it became a little bit about, how did you get that skill set? How did you learn to do that? What were your living conditions like? Did you work all hours that God gave? Those sorts of things were. those are all gradual developments as this journey
Because people
continues.
want to relate and find out if they can do that, if they're capable, like they want to know what you did so they can relate their lives to yours, right?
Yeah, that is where it began to develop, and I began to get that realization that I saw that I was really taken with this dress. And then I was like Googling and finding out, seeing people all over the world saying, "Oh yeah, I've made my replica of Isabella Mactavish Fraser dress," and I'd look at them and think, "Great, fantastic! I know how hard it is to get 18th century tartan sets, to get the right tartan look. Modern tartan is not the same look. The tartan
Mm-mm.
I'm wearing is not an 18th century tartan set." I knew that, but forgive all that. It's looking at the gowns and thinking, "Oh, if only they've seen the back. If only they had a little bit more information about the design features and how the dress was put together." There's some patterns out there that will get you, fairly close to the right look, but they're constructed differently. And I thought, I want to study this further, and I want to see if I can make it possible for other people to understand how the dress was made, and not just have it be this pretty thing
Right.
in a display case behind glass. It's like, actually, so many people love this dress enough to want to make it. And so many people already had. That's what I couldn't believe, is how many people already had, just based on the little information they had. Usually one photo, the same photo that I saw on Pinterest, that one photo, and everyone goes, "Oh, I want to have a go at that." And they've made them. Um, and some resemble it fairly closely and others don't. But not understanding the order of how it was put together,
Right.
and how how dressmakers work, then I thought, I can illuminate that. I mean, I can through research and recording it and studying it and then sharing that. There's no way I was just going to keep it to myself. It became just too important. Um, that I kind of the rest is history, I suppose. But the journey is still ongoing, and it has opened amazing doors to amazing conversations with academics and museum curators and textile experts and all sorts of people that I wouldn't have had such incredibly meaningful
Right.
conversations with and information with if it hadn't been for this dress in the project. I'm sure you're aware American Duchess put together
Mhm.
a documentary of their experience.
Yeah.
Coming
Yep.
in from America. They both, of course, been to Scotland before. Abby lived in Scotland for a year when she was doing her postgrad at Glasgow. So they're familiar with Scotland, but
Right.
they hadn't met all of us. We hadn't all 8 of us got together beforehand. So their experience coming over here and kind of diving in like that, diving in, but also in a way, their knowledge and kind of leadership was quite crucial. So
Right.
um, it's a wonderful documentary. Kind of, for me, it was watching the documentary. It was kind of seeing it through their eyes, which was really lovely.
So let's talk a little
Yeah.
bit about, because you've touched on it some, but since this is the beginner's guide to the 18th century, I definitely want to chat about that because so many people who are watching this are either interested in being part of the 18th century community. Maybe they're thinking about sewing. Maybe they're overwhelmed by that. I know I certainly was. And so I guess, what advice do you have for people who are maybe lurking about the community, trying to figure out how to put their toe in the water? Maybe they've been in
Mhm.
for a little while and they're like, okay, now I'm ready to make my first gown. Anywhere on that spectrum of being still a newbie.
Yes. Well, firstly, you're not alone. Everyone starts somewhere. No one is born, grows up, reaches adulthood, goes to their grave knowing this unless they've applied themselves to learning. So everyone has that first trying to thread a needle. You know, that's kind of the beginning. Um, and oddly enough, 3 years ago, I was in exactly those shoes. I had not sewn anything in 30 years. And my sewing prior to then was machine sewing.
Mhm.
My mother was a very accomplished seamstress. I have two younger sisters. I have older siblings as well, but I have two younger sisters. My mother sewed up until we reached sort of teenage years, sort of hit puberty, and she could no longer fit us all the same way, and it had and my mother was not that great at fitting. But we basically, everything we wore, but certainly anything that was nice, she had
Mhm.
made.
Yeah.
When I became a teenager and I wanted to carry on having homemade things, I signed up for a sewing class in high school. I think it was specifically a sewing class. It wasn't just home economics. Uh, and a lot of that was because my mother wasn't about to turn her teenagers loose on her sewing machine at home. So if I wanted to sew, I had to do it in class. And I went in before school to sew on my projects. But once I graduated from high school when I was 18, never touched a machine again. Never picked up a needle again. I had a certain number of kind of sewing supplies knocking around. But so 3 years ago, when this idea of, I love this, I'd like to learn to make it, I was a rank, absolutely newbie, a beginner. And I spent several months just wrestling with the, when will I be ready to start? When will I have read enough, looked at enough, studied enough? When will I be ready to start? And at some point I decided I just had to start. And I think that getting over that first starting, the very first project, and my very first thing was a shift, and it was an utter disaster. It was completely, I named it Hagrid and threw it in the back of the wardrobe. Enormous. It was the size, it was completely horrible. And I basically thought, okay, I'm going to start with the skin out undergarments. So having this disaster of a shift, I then embarked on stays. Wearing them now. They've done good service, but I will soon be wearing new stays. I've made stays since then, and I've made stays for other people, and I've learned pattern drafting, and it's still, but these first stays chose the wrong pattern. They said they were for historically accurate construction, and they were not. It was one of those things about halfway through, struggling, trying to come up with shortcuts, thinking this is just agony, but I'm going to power through. But meanwhile, kept on studying, kept on reading, and you get about halfway through and then identify, have the eureka moment, and you realize why it's all going wrong. You've started wrong, you're continuing wrong, and it was just wrong. But I was already half through, and I just thought, swearing to yourself, it's not going to beat me, and I finished them. And they're wearable. I mean, they have been wearable. I mean, I wore these, I've worn these days, long days, day after day, and they do the job. They're supportive, good posture. They do the job.
Do you feel like that was the project that really taught you what you needed to know to pursue this?
Yeah, because I think learning any new skill, half the battle, if not more than half, is mental, is learning with yourself to be patient to yourself. When you get frustrated, knowing when to just walk away, calm down. I've since discovered, some people call it, putting it in timeout. Yeah. Things like you learn, it's all sorts of mental kind of coping, but you learn a lot about yourself and your ability to solve problems. I find there are some projects that I kind of find myself kind of dithering and making very slow progress on, and then I'll wake up one morning and realize what's really been going on is some sort of doubt or some sort of confusion, and it's been subconsciously holding me back or slowing my progress, because a lot of times it's because I'm a little unclear what comes next. Everyone goes through that. And I think the beauty of something like this that is creative, you are starting with raw materials and you are producing a finished product. And sometimes it's just a few steps to get the finished product, and sometimes it's very complicated. I mean, fittings. And there are days that I'm making a gown that even if I'm working with my own shapes that have been cut on me, it will involve several fittings, and I might have 2 days that I'm more or less living in my stays and working in my stays, because I'm going to be trying the thing on over and over and over again. I don't want to be taking the stays on and outside of working in my stays. And that in itself, I think, is educational, to realize how functional all these garments are. But you go through that process, beginning, middle, end, and what happens in the middle is usually the feelings of dissatisfaction or struggles that you might have often have very little to do with the garment itself, but it is about wrestling with uncertainty and, is this right? I'm not sure if this is right. Oh, this doesn't look the way I expected. It's those sorts of self-doubts and struggles. I think that is the major, the predominant element to perfecting or learning and mastering any craft, whether you're a painter or a carpenter, anything that you're working with your hands, but you're working with your head too. And the battle half the time is what's going on in your head. And it's mastering that and controlling that. And sometimes it's about working that energy that's frustration right now, working it into something that means problem solving, that you can at least, even if you're not sure it's the right solution, you know it is a solution and you're going to pursue it. And then the other aspect I think for newbies, and that I'm going to acknowledge, and I don't have a silver bullet solution here, but the other thing is finding out what resources you can rely on and trust, knowing who you can ask, who are going to give you objective and a nuance, that there usually is no black and white, right and wrong answer. There are, as they say, more than one way to skin a cat. And just about any project you're working on, there are lots of different ways. And the more extant surviving garments you look at, while basic principles are the same, every dressmaker had her own way of working, her own solutions to whatever it was that came across. And they sometimes were mistakes that she had to fix, and sometimes they were just fitting problems or fabric not behaving the way she wanted to or expected it to, or a little miscut. When we face those exact same challenges today, and we don't have the 7-year apprenticeship or 5 to 7 year. We don't have the apprenticeship training that they did. Sewing is not instinctive or natural. Creating something has to be learned. Back then, they learned it and they were taught it, and it took years. Nowadays, I think a lot of us, when we're beginning, we're knocking ourselves down and we're beating ourselves up for not getting it, for not producing good work immediately. And we're thinking that somehow we've got some advantage, that somehow we're advanced. Women back then didn't have the advantages we have. Maybe we're using a machine, we're using rotary cutters, we're using all this technology, and we're using patterns and all these things. And we think, oh, somehow it should be easier for me than it was for them. No way. We're often kind of making it up as we are learning as we go along. If we're lucky, we've got a community that helps. And that is actually where historical communities, I think, are fantastic for access to people who will help, who want to help, who can help. Half the battle then is asking, looking, reading, identifying who it is that actually may know something about the thing that you want to learn about, and then reaching out to them, contacting them. And I have yet to come across anyone who says no. Anyone who's really knowledgeable and really skilled is also usually humble enough to not pretend and to not go, oh, I know, I've studied for 30 years. You think I'm going to hand it all to you now? No, they're all just eager to help, eager to share, eager to teach. And right now, it seems to be kickstarted quite a lot by the coronavirus, all the virtual aids. Burnley and Trowbridge with their sew-alongs, starting with this project, the things that are absolutely at the level of, if you've not threaded a needle before, this is where you start. In the last 6 months, I've met the folks at Burnley and Trowbridge, the folks in the tailor shop in Colonial Williamsburg, also the ones connected with Colonial Williamsburg who've gone through the training programs and have now set up their teaching and will take on students, they'll do class or they'll do one-on-one. So Sarah Woodyard, Sewn Company, qualified mantua maker through the Historic Trades Program, Colonial Williamsburg. She does private students and virtual classrooms. And again, she's it's very accessible, and she's very reassuring, it's very positive. And you just, at no point do you feel like, oh, I'm holding everybody back, or this is too hard, or I'm not good enough, I shouldn't be here. And I think that's really important, is that people realize, yes, you belong here. Yes, you should be here. That no one should be made to feel, whatever the skill level, that they don't belong here.
I didn't make a shift first. I guess I didn't get the memo that that's the thing that you make first. So I needed a petticoat. I want to back up and say, I have been very fortunate to be able to buy a large part of my wardrobe from talented people. But I did end up making, within my first 6 months, maybe. I don't know. I made three petticoats. That's what I have. My claim to fame is 3 petticoats. I made 2 linen and a wool, and I made a muslin mock-up before those. So I guess 4. The muslin was terrible. So, but I made all my mistakes there, and I realized, and I was so, and I've made an apron since, and I'm almost finished with my 2nd apron. And I was so lucky that I had Brett Wallace of 18th Century Tailor, because we reenact together. And, I would go to him just stressed out. What does this stitch even mean? And he's like drawing the stitches out with a marker and sending them, texting them to me from his job. So I think it's so important to be able to find those people. I also, one thing I want to say is that I had, you touched on this. I had this mental notion that because I wasn't immediately good at it and I didn't enjoy it, that I wasn't meant to do this. So really, I spent a year walking around saying, yeah, it's not for me. I'll just pay people. And I realize now very, very recently, I think that's one part. And I want to say, like, a lot of people know Instagram is like, that's what I love. It's what I teach as, a marketing consultant in this community. I love Instagram so much, but I also have to always remind people, you cannot compare yourself to what's happening on Instagram. So if you're going to follow a bunch of talented costumers and look at their beautiful sewing and their beautiful stitches, you need to understand that you don't compare yourself to them. So when people seem like they love sewing and it's all they do, and then you think, I love sewing about as much as I love loading the dishwasher, you start to like really doubt your ability to do this thing, especially if you've just kind of like been able to rely on other people to do it for you. So, which was great because I could go to an event looking, historically accurate, but also, I didn't have to necessarily figure it out. And very recently, what I have realized is that it's okay if you didn't love it, because I guarantee you a lot of our ancestral women didn't love it. And like loading the dishwasher, I don't have to love it. I just have to do it. So,
Yes.
Right. There are things that I am really good at that I really, really love, that a lot of people are not good at, and they would not love those things. And it's all apples to oranges, and we don't need to compare. And it's okay to love the things that you love. And then, but also, if you do want to learn to do these things, it's okay to learn to do them and not love them. Or maybe I'll grow to love them. I don't know. I think the fact is I wasn't even giving myself a chance. And, you're like the 3rd person in a week that I've interviewed that had the same experience as me. A mom who sewed, who's like, don't go near my sewing machine, who made all of my clothes growing up. And I took home ec because, back in the day, you got to do that. My teenage daughters won't ever get that experience. And I made, we had to sew initial pillows. So I made 2 Ks. A K is really hard to sew, guys. It's really hard. I had to make 2 of them. I'm sure I did not.
Try an R.
Right. So, I had this, I just really, I think because my mom was so good at it that I just compared myself to her, and that it didn't come naturally. And she grew up doing it and she loved it. I just wasn't interested. So anyway, all of that to say that we need to come into this and just drop all the notions that we come into this, because in general, that's just kind of like life. And as an entrepreneur, as a business person, as a coach, I deal with people every day that come into their businesses with these ideas about who they are. And it's just like, leave that at the door. We're starting fresh. And I think this has been really empowering for me to speak with you. I've been speaking to Sarah Woodyard and others lately, and just feeling incredibly encouraged and like, oh, maybe I'll attempt a gown. Maybe I'll, I'm going to make another petticoat soon, just for fun. And that's exciting. And I also, for people who are just watching this and don't know, I am working on a membership community for the Beginner's Guide to the 18th Century. So that those resources that you're talking about, Rebecca, you can find them all in kind of one place, and then you can take it further and do what you want to do with it. Because I think that can be the hardest thing, is like, when I came in, I didn't know how to find the Sarahs and the you and the, all the people who are available to help. I didn't know how to find them. So I'm really passionate about that. I'm really passionate about making it, easy to find on Google. How do I do this,
And what's great is you get in these classes taught by knowledgeable, helpful people, And you tend, I think more often than not, you find that you're being told you've had it right all along.
Yeah.
You've been wasting energy on thinking, oh, this might not be right. Couple of things you touched on about when you're beginning. You do not have to outfit yourself head to
Mm-mm.
toe,
Mm-mm.
in, out. I mean, I made a shift in stays to get started, but I
Right.
didn't make supports right away. Um, I went straight to a jacket and petticoats, and my research, I hadn't got to the point yet to realize that actually in the British Isles, gowns were much more commonly worn than jackets and petticoats, separate. Our
Right.
concept of separate
Right.
didn't exist then.
Yeah.
They were in gowns, so that took me a while. But meanwhile, it took me a little while to appreciate how it's millinery that finishes your look, and it is a difference between looking like you're kind of costumey to looking like living history. And that first 6 months, I didn't really appreciate that. I was constantly losing my handkerchief. Left it in the car, left it here, left it there. Caps, I was like, oh, I hate making them. So I bought a fair few, and Penny River, Jess at Penny River, godsend, mitts, apron, everything. The first 6 months, any millinery I had, got from her.
Yep.
I wasn't making it. I just wasn't valuing the time I valued it enough to pay for it, and
Right.
and thank
Right.
God it's available. But you're right. If it's something that you are not interested in making, particular thing, or you just feel like I need more headspace, as well as time to learn how to do that. Hand rolled hems took me several years before I felt I was ready to try it. I had it built up in my mind as this really, really advanced skill that I just felt like I needed to master a whole lot of other stuff before I attempt hand rolled hems. And then Sarah, her class this past winter, I realized, you know what? There is a little bit, it's not a knack, but when someone gives you the tips to how to do it, and you realize, oh, I would never have guessed that. I would never have worked that out. But the feel for it, it's actually not hard.
Right.
And it's one of those things I don't think I particularly enjoy, but I enjoy the results. I like it when it's done. I like it when it's done.
Right.
Is
I
better
like it when it's done. Yes.
And I the last 6 months, I've really, after the Isabella gown, I had a little bit of well, what gown comes next? I kind of didn't have a next big gown that, and I still, in a way, don't. So the last 6 months, I have focused on millinery, and have learned to enjoy it to the level of taking a certain satisfaction and knowing that I'm doing an adequate, satisfactory job. It would take a lot more practice to get really, really fine. I mean, the tiniest rolled hems. That's fine. That's fine. I now know what's involved in doing that. And that's, I think, the way with any new skill, is that you reach a point of, I understand this well enough to decide, is this what I want to go on and master, or dare I say, kind of specialize in, like Amber, Lady of the Wilderness at Virgil's Fine Goods. Her rolled hems are just to die for. And if you want the best, a cap with the finest rolled hems, it's worth paying her to do it. I mean, rather than the frustration yourself. But it's things like that. If you give it a go, you give it an honest try, and you struggle with it a little bit and try to come up with solutions, and then you decide, actually, I'm just going to finish this. Finish it. Done is better than perfect.
Yes.
But if you never do another one, that's okay. I now know what's involved with that. I'm happy to buy that from someone else while I go pursue something that I think I will actually enjoy or get more satisfaction from. And I think that is, I think, to all people new to this hobby, or, hobby is, I don't want to deground it, but this new passion, this new activity, this new community, you don't have to be good at everything. You don't have to be good at anything, as long as you enjoy it. And there will be certain things you try that you just will never do again. Well, there's other things you'll go on and try. And some people like to just constantly go on and try new things, and that's okay. And other people like doing the same thing and get really, really good at that one thing. And across the spectrum, everything in between. So there's room for everyone, no matter how your brain works when you're creating, and what your motivations are, what your goals are, and what use you're going to put these skills to, with where you're going to wear these garments. In everyone, it's a broad church, if you like.
It really is. And I think there's so many camps per se in the community. You know, it's the costuming community and it's the reenacting community, and it's like it's interpreters. There's so many, and then within each of those, there's all of these rules, and there can be fighting, and you know, yeah. So that's just like that's not me. I am a big like there's room for everyone, and you figure out what's right for you, and that can be taken as, oh, you're just giving people an excuse to look bad. And no, I'm not. I'm giving people a reason to be empowered. Yeah. To be empowered by this. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that's it, because the information and the information is there and the skills can be learned. It's why limit yourself by thinking just doing good enough. I mean, good enough is good enough, and done is better than perfect. But this idea that, oh, if you're going to have a welcoming community, that means you have to basically have really low standards.
Right.
Your standards for yourself are not anything to do with anyone else. And I absolutely firm believer that when it comes to standards, that's you and you alone. That you should not be voicing, thinking, giving any kind of vibe about standards to anyone else and about their work. But if there's anything that you see that where help would be welcome, then by all means let them know of the resources that are available, the people who are there to teach, and the facilities and things that are out there, if they wish to avail themselves of them.
Right.
But sometimes people get to a certain level and they don't know that there is anything different and or better. They just don't know. And it is, I mean, for me, it wasn't until I started looking at extents in museums that I was just looking at well-made clothes, other people that 21st century makers were making, and using that as the standard. Once I started looking at extents, all those structures and rules disappear. It was done in all different ways, and their purposes in making the clothes the way they did was different from what we've grown up accustomed to in modern culture, modern society, and industries. Back then, they knew this fabric was valuable and that you were going to need to maintain that fabric and reuse it. So things were made with big sloppy stitches because it'd be easy to take out, so you could remake that fabric into something else. And so whenever I see anyone passing judgment on the quality of the stitching, no, get off that. That's just ego. Egos are fragile.
Yeah.
Should be leave the egos at the door.
Right. There's no place for that. Yeah. Well, this has been so exciting. What a great conversation. And I know you and I, you know, have some ideas in the future about you coming to North Carolina to talk about the gown. And I hope that will all still work out. Who knows what the future looks like right now, but I think eventually we will get you to North Carolina. Rebecca Olds, timesmith-dressmaker.co.uk. Thank you so much, Rebecca. This was wonderful. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks.